Let us, let us have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your love. You are the King of glory. We thank you, God, because we see that in these last days your Spirit is working mightily in the hearts of your remnant church, and that you are sending us out on a particular mission so that every soul that can be won would be won. Father, help us because we are weak and we are frail, but we know that our weakness is made perfect. Your strength is made perfect in our weakness. Send your Spirit now, Lord, as I attempt to just share some of the incredible things you've done in my life to inspire my brothers and sisters in the faith, that we might go forward boldly in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Wow. This is my first time in New Zealand. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you all for having me. God bless you. This has been quite a journey. You know, there's an adversary. How many of us know that there's an adversary? And I'm sure you might have seen that I was scheduled to speak on Sabbath and a couple of other times. And unfortunately, in this great controversy, we don't know when we're going to come up against different challenges and trials. We went to the airport, me and my wife, my beautiful wife. Baby, just raise your hand and say hello. That's my beautiful wife, Elaine. And we got to the airport and we realized that the ETA, I don't know, are you all familiar with the ETA? Yes, we had the wrong ETA. We thought we had the one to stay, but it was just the one to just get out. And so we tried to change it. And sometimes they say it takes only 5 minutes. Sometimes it can take a day. But we went through all the different possibilities. Went through the kiosk. We got help. We got everybody to try and help us, and they couldn't help us. And we weren't able to get on the flight. We missed the flight. And it's amazing how God works, amen? Because we found out that very flight that we were supposed to be on, that the plane had mechanical problems. Praise the Lord. And the flight was delayed by 5 hours. And we would have missed our connector if we had gotten on the plane. So, sometimes you pray that God, we're saying, God, please let us make the flight. But God's saying, no, actually, I know what's best for you. It's best if you don't make this flight. You don't want to be on a plane that has mechanical problems and is 5 hours late. So we rescheduled. We were waiting on the ETA, and it was saying pending. And we checked it, and the next morning, pending. And then our flight was supposed to leave on Friday, pending. My wife said, baby, I don't know. What are we going to do? I said, we're going to go to the airport by faith. And she said, amen. So we prayed, and we went to the airport, pending. I walked up to the kiosk, pending. I put our passport in, pending. It said, your flight is not permitted. There's an error with your passport, just like it said the day before. Call an attendant. I called an attendant, pending. The attendant looked at the kiosk. He said, okay, it says there's a problem here. I guess we're just going to hit continue. He hit continue. Our tickets came out of the machine. Pending. That's the God we serve. And we ended up being able to get onto the flight without having the ETA confirmed until we had already landed in New Zealand. We weren't even supposed to be able to get those tickets. It doesn't even let you print it out. But we prayed, and God wanted us to be here. So I'm sure there's nothing I have, but there's something God must have for us to share with one another. Praise God. I think I have about an hour. I think I'll probably start by sharing a little bit of my testimony. I don't know, some of you might have heard of my testimony. Some of you might not have heard my testimony. So I think, I'm seeing shaking some heads. So I'm going to share a little bit of my testimony. I'm originally from Canada, a small place called Nova Scotia. Anybody ever heard of Nova Scotia? Okay. Yeah, some people know maybe Anne of Green Gables is right around there. Yes, that's what known for internationally. But I'm from a small town, and my city is a port city. So if you know anything about port cities, there's usually a mixed bag that goes along with that. It has some good things. There's a lot of culture. There's some universities in that area, but there's also, unfortunately, crime and things like that because people are trying to bring things into the port, and it creates a kind of what do you call that, black market economy. And so there's a lot of drugs and things like that. In my hometown of Halifax, only about maybe 500,000 people. So it's not a huge city, but it's a good size. And compared to some of the places I've lived, California, I lived there for quite a while. And so growing up there, I didn't have originally my mom had been in the faith before I was born, but she had left Christianity. She wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist, but she was a Christian, and she had left Christianity before she had me. I had 5 other brothers and sisters, and my mom was a single mother, and so we didn't have a father in the home. And one of the blessings of my early childhood was that my mom actually put me into foster care. Now, normally that can be a sad beginning of a story. That can be a difficult thing, but I was very blessed because my foster parents, who really are, for me, like just another set of parents, sometimes it takes a village to raise a child, they say, and they were older. They were in their senior years, and what had happened was my mother didn't want to give me up completely to the system, the social care system, and she wanted to find a way that she could co-parent because she was trying to go back to school when I was born. She was a mature student. She had 5 other kids. She knew she couldn't take care of me at that time, but she didn't want to give me up. And at the same time, she went to the social worker that she was talking to, and she said, I don't want to give up my child. I want to find someone who's willing to work with me. And they said, well, we don't do that. We take a child. If you can't take care of your child, we take the child, or you keep the child. But we don't do sharing situations. But it just so happened that my foster parents, because they were in their senior years, they were looking for a child. But because they were older, they were looking for a situation where they could help to take care of a child, but they knew they were going to be in their 80s and 90s by the time this child was in his teenage years, and they knew that they couldn't take on that full responsibility long term. And so God had already set up a situation. I believe there's a verse in Psalms where it says he'll take the single man and put him with the family. God brings families together. But the social worker was not aware of this, so my mother was very persistent and basically said, I'm not leaving until you guys help me with this situation. I'm not giving up my child, and I need help. And someone there knew about this family. They set me there, and it was a beautiful situation because they lived in the country. They weren't Adventists, they were Baptists, but they were very faithful to the light that they had. And, there was a blueberry field there, and there was lots of animals and fresh air and trees and summer camps, and they were faithful Baptists. They read their Bible. They taught me how to, do simple prayers as a child. And so I had these kind of 2 different upbringings. In my mom's house in the city, it was very rough. It was very urban. There was a lot of, very hardcore rap music and drug culture and all of this kind of influence. And then in my foster care family, it was very peaceful and serene. And, even though I wasn't a Christian, even though I didn't accept Christianity at that age, I think it planted a seed in my mind. It told me something about, what I later learned when I read the book Adventist Home many years later, and I'll talk about that later on. It talked about how your home can be a piece of heaven, a little piece of heaven. And I got to experience that reality and what Jesus in the home does for a home and for a family and for a community. And so I had that experience very early on. And while I was with my mom's family, like I said, she was in school, my biological mother. She was going back to university. And so she was around a lot of artists. She was around a lot of intellectuals and academics. And at one point, she was having some people over the house, and they were, not a party, but they were just socializing. And I was, somewhere playing. And one of the people that she had over her house was a producer for CBC, not BBC. It's the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And they had a program that they were working on. This producer was working for them a junior producer, and they were working on a show called Sesame Park, which is our Canadian affiliate for Sesame Street. Do you guys have Sesame Street on? Okay, in New Zealand, I think it's international. And they usually have some kind of, different ones for different areas. And so they had Sesame Park, and this producer saw me, and they were looking for a young child that was interested in, performing and singing and dancing and these kinds of things. And at that time, I was a huge Michael Jackson fan. I really loved Michael Jackson. Beyond, I wanted to be Michael Jackson, and it's interesting how that stuff works because, the entertainment industry and the enemy, they target children, and I feel like we could, as a church, learn a lot about how we can win souls because the enemy's out there trying to win souls too. He's in the same business, but he's just on the other side. And he's very, very shrewd in his operation. Michael Jackson, for me as a child, was larger than life. He was fantastic. He had all these abilities that seemed almost on the edge of beyond what seemed possible for regular people. And he seemed to love children. And that connected with me as a small child. And I thought, man, I want to be like that. And as Christians, we ought to make sure that children know that we love them. And that there is a more, children recognize that this world is broken. How many of us know that children recognize that there's something wrong with this world, that it doesn't quite match up, it doesn't quite feel right. There's something off about this world. And we ought to tell them that there's another place, a very special place that we're going to be able to go to. And that the person who's there, who's all powerful and all knowing, that he loves children. That's how we ought to present the gospel. But nevertheless, at this time, I was in this environment, and I was asked, my mother was asked, do you think your son would want to be in this program in Sesame Park? And my mother, I don't know why, I guess at that age, I was only five, maybe 6, but she always kind of treated us when we were kids almost like we were adults. And she said, well, ask him. And they said, do you want to be on TV? I said, yeah, and so that's how I started off in an entertainment career. I started working on Sesame Park, and then it got the bits got picked up and put on Sesame Street. And so I was doing some acting as a child, and it was kind of intermittent with the rest of my childhood. I had ambitions to do a lot of different things. I wanted to be an athlete, and my brother was a professional athlete. I wanted to, do different studies and sciences and things like that. But the thing that was consistent as I went through elementary, as I went through high school, was that my entertainment career just continued to seem to get traction. So I started producing videos for musical artists, and I hosted a radio show in my hometown, and then I started doing local productions and putting on live shows. And so it just kept becoming more and more obvious. By the time I was finishing high school, I was already making more money than my mother, who was working at this time. Now she had finished school and was working as a teacher, and I was making, comparable income to her just coming out of high school. And so for me, I had kind of a choice to make when I got to the end of my high school life was, do I want to go to school and maybe study science and maybe, play basketball, or do I want to see how far I can take this thing? And as I was walking, kind of contemplating that, walking down the street one day in my hometown, I ran into a buddy of mine named Daryl Kite. And Daryl was the host of a show called Street Sense, which was kind of a teen consumer show. They would, put up, basketball shoes and say which one's better, or acne cream and which one, better bang for your buck kind of thing. And I said, Daryl, what are you up to, man? How's the show going? And he said, actually, I'm leaving the show. I'm going back to school to get my law degree. And I said, oh, really? And Daryl was kind of like, similar height to me, young black guy, kind of, had this similar kind of feel. And so my wheels started turning, and I was like, well, who's taking your job? And I think he kind of picked up on what I was putting down, and he was like, well, let me look into it. Maybe you would be a good option. I said, yeah, maybe, And so he looked into it, and long story short, they brought me in for some auditions, and I ended up getting that job, which meant that I didn't end up going back to school that year. I did the show, and it's kind of interesting how, I've always felt like God is just, he doesn't put more on you than you can handle, because I found like in my career, and again, I'll talk more about this as I go, but there were always seemed to be parameters on how far I would be able to progress. God never let me get over my skis, so to speak. And so I did the first season of that show, and after 20 seasons straight of the show, it was their flagship show, they decided they were calling it. So I did one season, and that was going to be the end. And I'd now gotten a taste for this acting and hosting thing, and especially making the money. And I said, I talked to my coworker Gellery, and I said, Gellery, how do you get into acting more? Like, I've done my stuff as a kid, but in my hometown, I didn't have an agent, I didn't have any of that kind of stuff. It wasn't like LA or Toronto, it wasn't like a big market. I said, what do you do? And she said, well, you have to talk to a casting director. And normally there's a process. You have an agent, they submit you for different things that you might be good for, and then the casting director calls back your agent and calls you in. But I didn't know any of that. So I just picked up the phone, went through the directory, found a casting agent. There was only one in our hometown. I called them, and they said, hello. I said, hi, my name's Eli, and I'm an actor, and I'm wondering if you have any jobs, which is not how it's supposed to go. And they said, well, that's not how we usually do things. But I guess maybe they could tell from the tenor of my voice or whatever that maybe I was like African Canadian, and they could kind of feel I was young. And they said, well, we might have a job for you. If you can come in tomorrow and audition. Now, the job was not anything, glamorous. I think it was Thug Number 2 was was the role. But I took it very seriously. I wanted that job. And so I went in and I auditioned, and I, it's funny, I said to myself before I went in, I said, just whatever you do, don't hold anything back, and that way you'll know that, if you don't get it, at least you didn't leave anything, undone. And, I feel like oftentimes that's the mentality that we should carry as Christians, but we don't, it's like we hold back. But so I went in and I got the job. And so what that job did was it allowed me to get union credits. And union credits, because it was a unionized job, were kind of an opportunity to get you into the industry, so to speak. I thought it was much more than it was, because I had a sister who was in Toronto at the time, which is our big city in Canada, and our big movie city as well. And she had just gotten married, my second oldest sister, Jill, and her husband wanted to be an actor. And he was doing a lot of background acting, because if you did, I think, something crazy, like 320 days in a year of background, you could get a union credit, and you could start to work your way into the union. And he had been filling her head with this idea, because he wanted to be an actor, that the only thing that was keeping him from being the next Denzel Washington was just that he wasn't in the union. Like if he could just get in the union, it was like he was gonna be a millionaire. And so when my sister finds out that now I'm in the union, she's like, oh, you're gonna be, it's all happening for you. It's you're days away from being a A-lister. So she invited me to move from Halifax to Toronto to pursue acting and live with her and her husband and kind of sleep on their couch while I tried to make it. And so I moved to Toronto. I had a couple buddies there that were also trying to do different things. I had a musician friend and a model friend and a couple buddies. And I got up there. The person who had given me my first job as a little kid set me up with an agent. And they were terrible. They were a really bad agent. They were always on vacation. They never got me any jobs. But it was okay, because I was a terrible actor at the time as well. So we really suited each other. And I didn't realize I was bad. I just, I didn't prepare. I didn't know my lines. And so that didn't help me very much. So I was there for about a year. I didn't get any jobs. It wasn't going well for me. And I started thinking, well, maybe I'll go back to school and see about, studying sciences after all. No thoughts of God at this time, totally secular. In fact, I was partying. I was living a very worldly life. And so as I was about to kind of move back to Halifax to go back to school, I got a commercial. And this commercial was, it was like a government PSA. And it was, not a very big role, but it had a special element to it, which is that it got translated into about 8 different languages. And in the union at that time, if you did a job, every language that it gets translated into, you get paid as if you did a whole new job. So I was expecting to get, I don't know, maybe somewhere between $500 and $1,000, and I got 8 times that, which for me was a nice windfall that I wasn't expecting. And so when this dropped in my lap around that same time, I had a friend who was going to travel to Ghana, and they were going to do some backpacking over there. Now, just a little bit of background. My father was not in my life when I was younger, but I knew he was Ghanaian. I knew I had a grandmother over there. I knew I had family, and I'd always wanted to go. So the fact of me getting this money at the same time as my friend going, I said, you know what, maybe could I go with you? Could we travel, and I could go and maybe find my family, find that half of my family? And they were open to it. So I planned to go over, but I told myself, while I'm going over there, why don't I start to prepare for school? So there was a program called the Foundation Year Program at King's College in Halifax. And basically what it allowed you to do is you could make up a year. It was a 2-for-1 year, where if you did this program, it basically counted as 2 years worth of credits. And in this program, they had a reading list that you would have to go through. It was called now what was it called now? The books, the seminal books, or the something along that line of Western culture and civilization. Basically, the most important books. So you had like the Iliad, you had what else did you have? Gilgamesh, Epic of Gilgamesh. You had a lot of like ancient Greek. You had Shakespeare. All these kind of books that make up the foundation of Western culture. And I said, I'll start working on this list because I'm going to Africa. I'm going to be there. My plan was to just go until I ran out of money, which at that time, $8,000 could get you, a little ways in Ghana for quite a while. So I was like, I'll just go and I'll read while I'm over there. And so I decided I was going to take the biggest book on the list, and that happened to be the Bible. Yeah. And so I went. I didn't have a Bible. I didn't know where to get a Bible. I didn't go to my foster parents at that time because they had passed away. But when I was about 19, they passed away, and it was so I couldn't go to them. So I went to my mom because I knew she had been a Christian, and I had remembered one time when she was cleaning out her closet and going through things that there was this giant book, and it was funny. This is how little I knew about the Bible at this time. I had said to her when I saw the book and I saw it was written on it, I said, "Who's Holly Bibble?" In total sincerity, that's how little I didn't even recognize the Bible to see it. Because for me, I was like, man, this must be a really important woman because her name is the only thing on the book. It's just giant letters, Holly Bibble. So I was like, who is she? And my mom was like, oh, my poor, illiterate heathen son, right? So anyhow, so I knew that she had a Bible at one point because that was when I was younger. I said, Mom, do you have a Bible? And she said, yeah, actually I have this. It was our old family Bible. I don't use it. You're welcome to have it. And it was like, I wish I'd brought it with me. It was, those big leather bound, with the pictures in them. And this is another thing, right? I take this Bible thinking nothing of it. I go to Ghana, Genesis, and the one thing I tell myself while I'm going through it, because I knew immediately I had inherent bias, and it was going to stop me from really being able to go through it efficiently. So I said to myself, and now I believe it was the Holy Spirit that put these words in my mouth. I said, Eli, just don't judge anything until you get to the end of the book, because otherwise you're going to just keep stopping, and it's going to take forever. So just read the book. When you get to the end, then you can have all your conclusions. And at this time, I'm thinking it's going to be like Gilgamesh. I'm thinking it's going to be, kind of an assortment of these mythical stories and, that are going to be kind of ridiculous. And then I'll get to the end, and that'll be that, and I'll get to my next book. So that was what I said about it. But I bring this, giant Bible, and I'm walking around, and we're backpacking. I have my bicycle, and I'm just reading this giant Bible, just like I don't think anything of it. And this is so funny because it's now that I'm a Christian, I have more apprehension about carrying a big Bible, and many of us, I think, would be honest, we would feel uncomfortable too, than I did when I was a heathen. At that time, to me, it was totally fine. I'm reading a book. Why wouldn't I read this book? And that's, I've often had to question that and say, why do I now feel uncomfortable? I should be more bold now to carry that Bible everywhere I go. Now that I know that it's the truth, than when I thought it was just a book of stories. Anyhow, so I'm walking around, and of course, carrying a Bible that big in Ghana, if any of you have ever been to Africa, Africa is people are very passionate about their faith, regardless of what faith that is. There's more Christians now in Africa than I think in Europe and in North America. There's more Christians now there, but there's also Muslims. There's also people that practice voodoo practices. But whatever it is you practice in Africa, because it's a day-to-day necessity that you have a spiritual help, people are very passionate about what they believe. And so when I was walking around with this Bible, inevitably, I would get people coming up to me and asking me, what do you believe? What is your faith? And I would say, oh, no, I'm an agnostic. I'm just reading this as a part of my academic list. But by God's grace, it caused me to have certain interactions that were providential. So one of them was that the woman I was staying with, I call her my Antiocho, she had me watch, which, I don't promote film now. Obviously, I as my testimony will show you, I don't promote film. But at that time, she showed me The Passion of the Christ. And for where I was at that moment, it did something. I thought, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this, about what people believed. I didn't know this was what Jesus went through. I knew he died. I kind of knew something about a cross, but I didn't know this. And so that kind of stuck out to me. Another thing that stuck out to me was when I would walk through the streets, there would be young people late at night, 2, 3 in the morning, debating about spiritual things. Maybe they were coming from a party, maybe they were not, maybe, I don't know, but I noticed that there was a culture that I never experienced in the West, of people being very concerned about spiritual things, debating things, having thoughts about things. It was a very real part of their daily experience. And I had a few kind of interactions. As I was traveling, at one point I was traveling to see the slave castles. I was looking for my father, I was looking for my family, but I was also going around Ghana and backpacking and seeing different things and traveling West Africa. And as I was going to the slave castles, I met a guy named Emmanuel, and he was a doctor from Cuba who had gone to West Africa to volunteer medical services. He was a Catholic guy, and but when he found out that I was pursuing spiritual things, I was reading through the Old Testament. He came and talked to me, and he told me what he believed, and I said, "Oh, okay." But already, as I was reading the Bible, one of the things that I noticed, reading it from Old Testament all the way through, was that the stories were not like the other books. There was something real about them. There was something grounded about them. You would read things in Numbers, and then you'd look at the news, and the things you were reading in the Bible were things that were happening in the news. You'd read about Gaza, or you'd read about, Lebanon, or you'd read about today we see these things, right? We see what's happening right now with Iran. And so as I was reading it, I was like, this is not like Gilgamesh. This is not like Homer. There's something about this. And even though the way it described creation, the way it described human nature, it just felt real. And I was struggling with that as someone who didn't believe. I was going to school for science. I believed in evolution. I believed that the world had existed for billions and billions of years. So there was something that was troubling me, but I kind of pushed it down. So Emmanuel, he gave me, at that time I was a big Kanye West fan. I was very much into rap music. I don't know if any of you even know who that is, but he's more of a popular figure now, but he was a musician at one point, and I was really into rap music, and I was into rosary. So he gave me a rosary, and he told me, you could use this to pray, and kind of showed me a couple things, and I said, oh, okay, whatever. But I thought it was cool just for a fashion piece. So I kept it, moved on. I then went up to Burkina Faso, and I was traveling up there towards the northern border of Ghana to cross the border into Burkina Faso to do some traveling. And I had my bicycle. You could put it on the bus, and you drive the bus up there, and then you can ride around. And as I was on the bus heading up there, I ran into two gentlemen. One was a Protestant missionary from Ghana who was traveling around Ghana. And he, spoke with me, saw my Bible, asked me what I believed. I said, no, I'm just reading it as an academic book. And he said, I'm going to pray that you find your faith. And I thought, thanks, sure, whatever, right? But it's just something about the conviction with which he said it. It definitely, I still remember it to this day, many years later. And then, he got off the bus and went. And then another gentleman I met on the bus was a teacher, and he was from the far coast, and he was going to visit his family who lived close to the border in northern Ghana. So he sat down next to me, and we're on this bus for about 4 hours, and we start talking. And he tells me about his family. He has 11 brothers and sisters, and how he's a teacher, and what his part of Ghana is like. And I start to think, I know this guy. We're kind of friends. We've been talking for 4 hours. And, being from Canada, as, I'm 6'2", I'm a young man, I'm a black man, I've never perceived that I could be thought of as a target by someone else, by my accent, by my clothing, that someone might see me and see someone that they would want to somehow take advantage of. I never even perceived that in my mind until that point, that was even possible. So as I'm talking to this guy, I'm like, yeah, we're kind of friends. And we get to the bus station, and I say, okay, nice to meet you, man. Maybe I'll see you around. And he says, well, what are you doing? And I say, well, I'm staying here in the main town. Then I'm going to get a cab in the morning to the border crossing, and then I'm going to go into Burkina Faso. He said, don't do that. He said, I live right next to a YMCA. It's right across the border. You could ride a cab with me. We'll get our cab. I'll drop you at the YMCA, and then you'll cross over in the morning. It'll be way easier for you. And I said, oh, thanks. Yeah, okay, great. So I hopped in the cab with him, and we start driving. And, especially back then, and especially in that part of Ghana, once you leave the city, there's no electricity. It's pitch black. I don't know what it's like out here. We're about, 4 hours from Auckland. So I don't know, maybe at night here it's the same way. Once you leave the city in Ghana, there's no streetlights, there's nothing. It's just black. So we're going into the dark, and I'm thinking, okay, well, this is my buddy. We're good. So we get about an hour outside of the city, and we get out of the cab, and there is a YMCA, but it's closed. And I'm like, uh-oh. And he says, don't worry about it. I just live a little bit into the bush, about 15 minutes into the bush. You can come stay with me and my family. And now I'm like, and I'm feeling a little bit uneasy, but, this is my buddy. So, okay, that's all right. So I take my bike, and we're walking into the bush about 10 minutes or so. And we get out there, and it's just a big fire pit. All of his 11 large brothers and sisters. And their kind of matriarch, which was this, older lady, maybe his grandmother, maybe his mother, I'm not sure, sitting down. And it's mud huts. It's not, that's just how they live, and it's nothing wrong, but that's just what it is. And now I'm really uncomfortable. And so he says, meet my mother or whoever she was. And I go up to meet her, and she doesn't look at me. She looks at him, and she says something in her language. And I did understand one word, which was American. And he says something in his language, and then he says Canadian. And then she says, that'll be fine. And I said, oh, okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to get going. And I took my bike, and I started walking. I said, you guys, you know what? I think I actually am going to be okay. I'm going to figure it out. I don't want to put a burden on you guys. Get on my bike, and gone on my bike into the dark. And as I'm leaving, he calls out, there's no use running. My brother's gone to get the moto. The moto is, I don't know if they call them that here. That's the bikes, the motorbikes. So I'm now pedaling, terrified, somewhere in Ghana towards the road. Now, there was one street lamp where the YMCA was, but I can't see it where I'm at yet. The first miracle here is that I didn't hit anything. I didn't there's so many bumps and brush. There's not a lot of trees, but there was so much brush and holes and pits, and I'm pedaling in pitch black as hard as I can. I didn't hit anything. So I'm getting close to the road, and then I hear in the distance. His brother now trying to start up the moto. So I'm panicking. I get to the road, and when I get to the road, there's the YMCA here. It's on top of a police station, which I didn't know was a police station. And then across the road, they have what's called chop shops, which is like a little, I guess they call them bodegas in New York. It's like just a little hut, but it's a food store, like a corner store. And there's two guys, older guys, just manning the store. And it's, like I said, it's pitch black. I don't know what time it is, maybe 10 o'clock, but out there, it could be 3 in the morning. It's once the sun goes down, it's night. So I get there. I'm still hearing, they're trying to rev up, get this engine started. And I run over to these guys, and I'm like, I'm from Canada. My name's Eli. Please help me. These guys are after me. I don't know what they want from me. And the guys, are looking at me, and they point across the street. And I see it's a police station. So I'm like, thank you. Run across the street. Bang, 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 bang. Hi, my name is Oh, no. First it was, shh, we're closed. Shh. And so then I was like, no, you don't understand. I'm Canadian. I need help. There's people after me. And so then they, shh, and a barrel of a gun comes out of that thing. And he says, I said we're closed. And I said, okay. And he's, whoosh. So then I run back over across the street, and I say to these guys, I said, I need your help. I don't know what I'm going to do. These guys are after me. Please tell me, is there somewhere I can stay? Is there a hostel? Is there anything? And they point, and where they point to is like, the street goes like this. There's a street light here, and then there's like a little path that goes into pitch blackness. And I'm like, I'm not going down there. So I'm like, no, there has to be something else. There has to be some other way. And they point again. And now I hear the bike has started. So it's like, okay. So I said, okay, I have no choice. So I run over to that path, and I can hear the bike. And when I get to the path, I go a few feet into the darkness, and there's a little boy. He has a bicycle. He doesn't have a front wheel. It's just the back wheel, and he's wheeling this bicycle. I guess he must be going to get it fixed, or I don't know. It's his bicycle, and he's maybe 7 years old. He's tiny. And I run up to him, and I feel bad to this day, but I was terrified. I was like, little boy, please help me. There's people after me. I'm from Canada. I need your help. And this kid doesn't understand a word I'm saying. And he's like, I said, is there a hostel? Is there a hotel? And he points down the path. And I said, will you please take me? I don't want to go by myself. Will you please take me? And he's like, no, which he should have. He should have said no. He said, no, I'm not taking you. I said, please, I have money. I'll give you money. I need help, please. And I can hear the moto's now getting close to the road. And so he says, okay, I guess. And he starts walking me down the path. And lo and behold, maybe 30 seconds down the path, there is a little hostel off the path. And, one of the things I always say this in my testimony because at the very least, this is what I can say, because I feel bad to this day, because I said, I'll get you money. I had 100 Ghana cedi. I said, let me get some to break it. And then he said, no. And I said, well, then just take it. And he said, no. And I let him leave without the money. And, it's one of my regrets. So I always include it in my testimony because I feel like it was a thing that I wish I could change, but I can't change it. But I'm not going to hide it. So he didn't take the money, and he left. I was still terrified. I could now hear the moto on the road. And I ran into the hostel. I go into the hostel. I have my bike. I have my giant kind of luggage backpack. And I go in, and the guy working there says, no, you can't bring that in here. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. There's people after me. I think they want to kill me. I need to bring my stuff in here. I can't leave it out there. If they see it, I don't know if they're going to come in here. And he's like, no, you can't. So I take out my cell phone, and I call my Auntie Yako. And she picks up, and I say, Auntie Yako, there's people trying to kill me. And then it cuts. And I'm like, I have no credit. I'm out of credit. So thank God in Ghana, you can add credit to people's phones. I don't know if you can do that now everywhere, but back then you could add credit to someone's phone. So my phone rings, and it's my Auntie Yako. And I said, the guy's not letting me stay. There's people after me. She said, give me the phone. Give the phone to him. I gave the phone to him. They speak in their language. She worked something out, and he says, okay, you can stay. It's going to be 300 Ghana cedi. And I'm like, in my head, at that moment, I'll pay 1,000 Ghana cedi. I don't care if it's 1,000,000 Ghana cedi. They had just redone the cedi, so it was equal to Canadian dollars, but it didn't matter to me. I would have paid anything. So I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. He gives me a little room. I go in. I put my giant backpack on the bed, my bike next to the bed. I open up the giant backpack. And the one thing I noticed was when I went in that room, I had a lot of brothers and sisters growing up. I'd usually been around people. I'd never really been alone, really alone. That was the most lonely moment I'd probably ever had in my life. And I felt like I wasn't alone. I felt a presence at that time that I couldn't explain. And when I opened up my backpack, the first thing I saw was my giant family Holly Bible. I had my giant Bible. And I felt that presence, and I saw the Bible, and I said, okay, God. And this is the thing. Every testimony, I've heard testimonies, Elder Baylock at my old church at State Line, he used to be on crack cocaine, and he was in jail and he got off. I've heard people that were alcoholics. I've heard people that, just were atheists. I've heard every testimony, but it always comes to this moment where you say, okay, God, if you're real, I need you to get me out of this, and I will do everything I can to pursue you from that moment on. I've heard a lot of testimonies. I don't know, Pastor Kelly's here. He could probably tell you the same thing. It seems like no matter where those testimonies come from, they come to that moment where you have a conversation with God, and you need something that you can't do for yourself, and you need Him to come through. And if that and God meets you there, and so I saw the rosary, which, God meets us where we're at. I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know anything. So now I know, obviously, I'm with you. I know about the mark of the beast and all that stuff. But at that moment, I didn't know. And so I prayed, and I prayed all night. And Ellen White says that there are Catholics out there who are living up to the light that they have, that if they knew the truth, they would come into our faith. So, God understands that I was in ignorance, and I prayed earnestly, and I prayed with all my might that I would live. And I prayed, and I started to see the sun come up. And when I saw the sun come up, something happened, and I started to gain courage. And well, praise God, amen. But I also started to, as we often do, forget. And I stood up. And I said, Eli, come on, man, you were tripping. What are you doing? And I put the Bible in the thing, and I closed it, and I went out to the guy at the front desk, and I gave him his 300 Ghana CD, and I was like, oh, man, this guy ripped me off. Thanks. And I walked out and went to the border, and it was already starting to feel like a distant memory. And then my phone rang, and it was my Auntie Akko. And I said, hey, Auntie, I'm so sorry about last night. I know I was over, and she stopped me, and she said, Eli, I'm sorry. I didn't want to tell you this last night because I didn't want to scare you. But the area where you were, I wouldn't go there if the president of Ghana himself was escorting me. Those are her exact words. At that time, as you guys can see in different countries today, that area was held by rebels. It wasn't under the control of the Ghanaian government. And many of those people practice voodoo. And they will sacrifice, especially Westerners, because they believe that it gives them more influence with their pagan gods in their war. People go up there, they disappear, and you never hear from them again. And I knew God had answered my prayer. And I said, okay, all right, I'm going to follow through. Thank you. I'm okay. And so from that moment on, reading the Bible was a very different experience because now I knew God was real. And I was seeing the real God who had worked in my life working in humanity and history and prophecy and all of these things. I still didn't even know, at this time I'm reading the Old Testament, I didn't even know if Judaism, if Islam, if Christianity was real, because they all kind of follow a lot of the Old Testament. But I knew God was real, and I knew that He was on a path teaching me and showing me more and more as I read and as I learned. So as I'm in Ghana, I go back and I meet my Auntie Akko after I traveled through Burkina Faso, and I've been reading the Bible, and I'm asking her more spiritual questions. But one of the things that happens is, as I'm about to leave, I still haven't found my family. And it turns out that she knew them the entire time, but she didn't want to get involved in the drama of, a kid who, was trying to find his family. His father wasn't around, and that's a lot of stuff, especially in Africa. So, but because I was leaving right then, she said, I wish you had been a little more diligent to figure this out, but they're right around the corner, and I'm going to take you. And so she took me and as I was going to my grandmother's house, actually, I'll leave that part out. So I get to my grandmother's house, and she opens the door. I don't say anything. And she looks at me, and she says, "Oh, no, why did he do this?" And she knew immediately that I was my father's son. And she welcomed me in. She, it's funny with family, there's no time, there's no space, My father had been afraid that if she knew about me, that she might die because she was so old. But she ended up living to 103 years old. She was not an Adventist, but she lived a very active life. She ate very little meat. She ate a lot of vegetables. She always kept her mind stimulated. She followed a lot of our health practices, and God blessed her. And so we ended up having many years together. And but I stayed for a while. I extended my trip, and then I went back to Canada. And so I got back to Canada, and now I've had this revelation about God, and I've met my family, and this trip has just been life-changing. I often tell my wife, I don't remember a lot of life before that trip. It's like my life almost kind of started then. I don't know if some of you are old enough to maybe have had certain experiences where you kind of go, it feels like my life really kind of began then. Everything before that was just kind of just happenings, but that's when things started to have purpose. And so I get back, and I'm like, you know what? I want to give this acting thing one more shot. I never really gave it a real effort. I want to see where I can go with it. And then if I'll do one more year, and if it doesn't work, then I'm gonna hang it up. So I start to pursue it, but I pursue it with real intention. I start, doing a lot of student films, doing a lot of plays, just getting jobs, gigs anywhere I can. I meet a guy who kind of helps me. He's a coach, and I start to get better. And I start to get jobs. And so I book one series that kind of leads to me getting another series, and that was shooting in my hometown of Halifax, and it was, ironically, about a gospel choir. And I'm playing a tenor in a gospel choir. At this point, I've read just kind of, I think, finished the Old Testament fully, and I'm getting into the New Testament. And while I'm shooting the show, I'm still reading. And so one day when we're leaving the set and we're in our van, I'm there with the writers and the producers. And I know that because they wrote the show, I know that they're Christians. And so I asked one of them, Andy Marshall, to this day at Kenisa Fellowship. He's an elder there. And I give him a lot of credit for how he handled this situation. I asked Andy, I said, Andy, I've been reading the Bible, and I have a question about Christians. I said, why is it if the Bible says you should go to church on Saturday, you guys all go to church on Sunday? This is just from a person who knows nothing about anything. I just read the Bible as a text. And it's very clear that you should go on Saturday, the seventh day of the week. There's no way around it. It stuck out. It's everywhere in the Old Testament. It's all over. And so he says to me, and I always give him credit for this because, now I'm studying theology and I'm working in ministry. And I often think if a young person, a worldly person came to me and said, why don't Christians go to church on Saturday? I would have probably said, well, Constantine in 300 AD was this and that, and the mark of the beast, and the Pope, and the papers. And if he had done that to me, I would have been like, thank you, no thank you very much. Okay, bye. But he didn't do that. He handled it so well. And I often have asked him, how did you know to respond like this? All he said was, well, my church doesn't go to church on Sunday. And maybe when we're back in Toronto, if you like, I could take you, you could check it out. That was it. And that worked. That I could understand. And I said, Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much. Because I was eager. I was thirsty. I wanted to know. And I never knew that there was a church that went to church on Saturday. It was totally new to me. So we get back to Toronto, and true to his word, he, comes, picks me up from my house, takes me to Kanisa, which, you know, would be considered a liberal church by Adventist standards. But by my standards, Kanye West praying with rosaries in Africa standards, it was a very impressive experience. Now, I'm more conservative now. I go to Heartland. It's a conservative school, and people, know it for the Standishes and things like that. And I've learned a lot of things that I didn't know then. But it met me where I was at, and that's why, there's a place for all of our churches. And I think there's a lot of division amongst Seventh-day Adventists that doesn't need to be there because people are on a journey. And there's certain places where I could not have come into. If I had gone into it, it would have been too much for me. But going there, I saw, African-American men for the first time in my life wearing suits that were professional, that spoke eloquently, that were talking about sciences and politics and economics in the context of the Bible. It was amazing to me. It was totally I was astounded. And I said, this is what I've been reading. This church is what I've been seeing in the Bible. This is it. This is the church. And I started attending. Now, I didn't know anything about spirit of prophecy. That all came later. I didn't know anything about, dietary restrictions. There were a lot of things that happened that now would not make sense for me based on where I'm at in my journey. But I was learning, and I was gaining understanding about God's church. And so anyway, I continued to go to that church. And then I wanted to get baptized at a certain point once I finished the New Testament. And I was still not really clear on this whole salvation thing and how it works. And so I chose to go back home and get baptized at my foster mother's Baptist church. And because I thought, well, I want to honor her. And so I got baptized, and then long story short, because we don't have much time, I ended up leaving Toronto, going to Vancouver. My career started to really develop. My acting career started to, take off, and I got picked up by an agent in Los Angeles, and I went to Los Angeles. And while I was in Los Angeles, I kind of went to a few other churches, but then I found a church that was a little bit more present truth, just a little bit more, not a lot more. But I ended up talking with someone who wanted me to understand some things, and it was an elder there who gave me some Bible studies. And he says, have you ever been baptized? By the way, I hadn't told the people at Kanisa that I even got baptized. I just went to this church and got baptized. It doesn't matter. What difference does it make? And he said, have you ever been baptized? I said, yeah, I've been baptized. He said, well, what church were you baptized? I said, Lucasville Baptist Church. He looked at me and said, well, are you a Baptist? I said, no. He said, well, why did you get baptized in a Baptist church? I said, well, because my foster mother was the first one who ever taught me anything about God, and I wanted to honor her. And he said, well, who would she want you to honor? And I said, well, Jesus. He said, so then are you really honoring her if you get baptized in her respect? And I said, well, no, I guess not. And he said, so would you like to be baptized again? And I said, yeah, I guess. And so we did some studies, and I got baptized at Valley Crossroads Church in Pacoima, California. But it's interesting because there's been a difference how many people recognize that there's a difference in the world pre-COVID and in the church, pre-COVID and post-COVID? At that time, Ellen White was like a bad word. And, you'd have pastors that would preach, and they would say, one of my favorite authors says. And I'd be like, man, that was great. Who is that author? How come they never tell us the author? And they'd say, I read somewhere that. you know? And so I didn't know anything about present truth in that respect. I didn't know about prophecy. In fact, and I only have a few minutes here, but we're going to take a break and then we'll come back and I'll finish. At one point, I wanted to know about Revelation. I didn't know our church knew anything about Revelation. I had never heard anything about Revelation in our church. Believe it or not, this is pre-COVID. I was so desperate to learn about Revelation, I went on Audible. And I found some evangelical who has a whole series on Audible about Revelation. I listened to it, and I said, that didn't make any sense. So then, on Audible, another selection comes up as an option if you've listened to this first person. I won't say his name, just, because I don't want anyone to go listen to it because it's nonsense. But, and the suggestion that came up was Left Behind. I'm sure you've all heard about Left Behind. So I start listening to these Left Behind books on Audible while I'm going into Adventist church, not having any idea that we teach anything on Revelation. And I'm listening to these Left Behind books, and I'm thinking, man, they're super entertaining, but there's no way anyone actually believes this stuff. Dragons, invisible dragons flying around, breathing fire on people, and only the certain people can see them, but other people can't. And some guy who can speak every language is the Antichrist, and he looks like Brad Pitt. And because I'm working in the movie business, it sounds like a movie. It doesn't sound like real, right? So I'm entertained. I'm listening to these books, but I don't think much of it. Until I had an opportunity, because I was, an actor and my career was getting larger and I had a following on social media, I had an opportunity, and I'm wrapping up this first part here, to go to Israel. And to travel Israel, they wanted to bring actors and singers and, bring us over there for free. So I went over there, and I was getting out of the airport, and I'm listening to my Audible, and one of the people there, they're all evangelicals. I'm the only Adventist. And these are all Christian entertainers. And one of the people there says, hey, what are you listening to? And I said, I'm listening to these Left Behind. They said, oh, I love those books. And I said, yeah, I know, but it's not like anyone really believes this stuff. Silence, all 20 of them. And one of them says, well, what do you mean? Why not? And I was like, you guys don't believe that this stuff is real. I said, I don't know anything about Revelation, but I know this is not real. This is not what it is. And I had no idea. And they were like, it was like this most awkward, uncomfortable moment. And I was just like, or, whatever, and kind of just tried to play it off. And so we ended up having a great trip in Israel. But that's when I realized, hey, these guys actually believe this stuff. And so I get back to the States. I go there for 2-3 weeks. And when I get back to the States, one of my elders, who's still an elder of mine now, I call him my uncle, but Daryl Minor, God bless him. I'm in the parking lot, and they're having, I think it might have even been Neville Peter was visiting, singing at the church. It was wonderful. He was wonderful. But so they're inside, they're having a musical night, and I'm in the parking lot, and I'm listening to this thing on Audible, and my uncle asked me, hey, what are you listening to? And I said, oh, these books, I said, Revelation stuff on these Left Behind books. I said, they're not real. I know they're not real. And he said, well, if they're not real, you might want to be careful what you listen to. You don't want to just expose yourself to anything. And I said, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's true. And after he said that, I stopped listening to them. I just cut it off and still didn't know anything about Revelation. And it was later when I would learn, but our time's up. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then I will finish the rest of my testimony when we come back. Enjoy your break. you.